Following the Civil War in the United States, slavery had been officially abolished under the 13th Amendment. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, which granted civil and legal rights to African Americans and previous slaves. And later, the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. However, the failure of the government to enforce these amendments following the Reconstruction period, the years after the war from 1865 to 1877, created a devastating prominence of continued discrimination against blacks, especially in the South. In the South, state laws were instituted to separate black and white racial groups through laws called Jim Crow laws that supported the idea of separate but equal facilities, forcing African Americans into de facto, which means segregation in fact rather than actual law, second-class citizenship. During the Reconstruction time period, barriers were created throughout the South to deter and prevent African Americans from voting. These barriers included voter literacy tests that blacks had to pass in order to vote, which would be difficult for African Americans due to their lack of an education. Over 60% of black men could not read. There were also annual poll taxes that voters had to pay to vote, which would be an economic burden for many black individuals. Lastly, places such as Mississippi enacted rules like the Grandfather Clause, which barred blacks whose grandfather could not vote from voting. The Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968, a century after the failure of the Reconstruction, was a spurt of civic activism in direct opposition to the prolonged form of discrimination against blacks. During the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, peaceful participants in a march for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery were met with state troopers who attacked them with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips. This violence against marchers, captured on television, would create public outrage among Americans. The incident and public response would lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders were present at the signing. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 would aim to end the legal barriers for black voting and federally reinforce the 15th Amendment. The federal government had a means now to help enforce the 15th Amendment from state control. Johnson, in his Voting Rights Act address, would declare that, quote, "All Americans must have the privileges of citizenship regardless of race. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." The Voting Rights Act of 1965, Section 2 would say, quote, "No voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedure shall be imposed or applied by any state or political subdivision to deny or abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race of color." It would ban the use of literary tests for voting qualifications. It created federal oversight of voter registration in places where less than 50% of the non-white population did not vote, and authorized the United States Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in states and local elections. The state and local enforcement of the law was weak, and it often was ignored outright, mainly in the South. However, there were many advances. It advanced the civil rights movement by giving African American voters the legal means to challenge the de facto voting restrictions and vastly improved voter turnout. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among blacks increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 transformed patterns of political power in the South. By the middle of 1966, over 500,000 Southern blacks had registered to vote, and by 1968, almost 400 black people had been elected to office. In conclusion, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed a century after the end of the American Civil War. After a century of continued racism and discrimination, the Voting Rights Act finally gave power to the deserving African American population. It would be a symbol of an inclusive step toward equality. The federal government was making a statement that it would stand behind African Americans in their fight for equal rights to suffrage. This act does not mark the end of the civil rights story. It is only the beginning.